Picture this: you're pressed against the cold marble wall of the papal apartments, your breath coming in shallow gasps as you peer around the corner into chambers where no servant should ever venture. The year is 1501 AD, and through the golden glow of hundreds of candles, you witness something that will haunt your dreams forever. Pope Alexander VI, the Vicar of Christ himself, sits upon his throne with his daughter Lucrezia beside him, not as a visiting child, but nestled against his robes like a lover. Her golden hair spills across his shoulder as she feeds him wine-soaked figs with her own fingers, her lips brushing his ear as she whispers secrets that make him laugh with the intimacy of shared sin. Your hands tremble as you realize what you're seeing. This is not fatherly affection. This is something far darker, far more forbidden. The rumors that have whispered through Rome's shadows are true. The Pope, God's representative on earth, may be sleeping with his own daughter. And tonight, as Lucrezia's hand rests protectively over her swelling belly, you understand that the child growing within her might carry the blood of the holiest man in Christendom through the most unholy union imaginable. If you believe history's most damning secrets deserve to be remembered, subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Because tonight, we're opening the Vatican's most forbidden vault, the one they prayed you'd never find. Rome in the late 15th century was not the eternal city of marble and glory tourists visit today. It was a festering wound of a metropolis, where cardinals purchased their red hats with bags of gold and papal nephews ruled fiefdoms built on the bones of their enemies. The streets reeked of human waste and political ambition in equal measure, and in the taverns near the Tiber, men wagered not on horses or dice, but on which prince of the church would die of poison before Easter. The papacy itself had become something unrecognizable, a throne of temporal power that happened to come with spiritual trappings. Popes were warlords in silk, bankers in mitres, kingmakers who treated the keys to heaven like the deed to a profitable estate. They fathered children openly, murdered rivals casually, and sold indulgences like merchants hawking fish in the marketplace. The Holy Spirit, it seemed, had long since abandoned the Vatican to more earthly forces. Into this cesspit of sanctified corruption strode Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia, a man whose appetites were legendary even by Roman standards. Spanish by birth, Italian by adoption, and Machiavellian by necessity, Borgia had spent decades climbing the ecclesiastical ladder with a combination of cunning, charisma, and carefully placed gold. He threw parties that lasted for days, kept mistresses with the casualness other men kept horses, and fathered bastard children with a frequency that would have made rabbits envious. By 1492, when the papal throne became vacant, Rodrigo Borgia saw his moment. He was 58 years old, silver-haired and still handsome, with piercing dark eyes that could seduce a novice or terrify a rival with equal ease. More importantly, he was rich fantastically, obscenely rich, and in Rome, wealth was the truest form of holiness. The conclave that would elect the next pope gathered in the Sistine Chapel, beneath Michelangelo's ceiling that would not be painted for another 20 years. 23 cardinals locked themselves away, ostensibly to pray for divine guidance, but God, it seemed, spoke in the language of florins and ducats. Rodrigo Borgia's agents moved through the conclave like shadows, dispensing gifts with the precision of military strategists. A bishopric here, a palace there, a chest of gold for the wavering, a beautiful young servant for the lonely. When the white smoke finally rose, it carried with it the stench of simony, the buying and selling of holy office. Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia emerged as Pope Alexander VI, having purchased the throne of St. Peter for approximately 100,000 gold ducats. Some said the Holy Spirit had chosen him, others knew better. The devil, it seemed, paid better wages than God. The new pope wasted no time in transforming the Vatican from a place of worship into a palace of earthly delights. Alexander VI was a man of appetites, and papal power only amplified them. Within weeks of his coronation, the austere papal apartments were redecorated with tapestries depicting pagan gods in compromising positions, and the scent of exotic perfumes began competing with incense in the Vatican's corridors. But Alexander's greatest innovation was bringing his family into the very heart of Christendom. Previous popes had at least maintained the pretense of celibacy, keeping their children at arm's length and calling them nephews. Alexander VI felt no such need for discretion. His children were installed in the Vatican with the fanfare of legitimate heirs. Cesare, dark and dangerous, was made a cardinal at 18. Giovanni, the Pope's golden boy, received lands and titles like birthday gifts. And then there was Lucrezia. Lucrezia Borgia was 18 when her father became Pope. with wheat gold hair that caught the light like spun silk, and eyes the color of winter sky. She moved through the Vatican's marble halls like a goddess walking among mortals, her every gesture watched and analyzed by ambassadors, cardinals, and courtiers who couldn't decide if they were more terrified or enchanted by her presence. She was, by all accounts, breathtakingly beautiful, but beauty in the Borgia household was never merely ornamental. The Pope lavished attention on his daughter that bordered on the obsessive. He insisted she dine with him privately every evening, their conversations lasting long into the night while the rest of the Vatican slept. He showered her with jewels that would have made queens weep with envy, and dressed her in gowns that cost more than most nobles spent in a lifetime. Most unnervingly, he required her presence at official audiences, where she would sit beside his throne like a co-ruler, her pale hand resting on the arm of his chair. Ambassadors wrote home with barely concealed horror about what they witnessed. The Venetian envoy described dinners where the Pope and his daughter fed each other from the same plate, their fingers lingering together over shared morsels. The French ambassador reported seeing Lucrezia seated in the Pope's lap during a private audience, both of them laughing at some private joke while he stroked her golden hair. These were not the gestures of a father toward his child. They were the caresses of a lover. The papal apartments themselves became a stage for increasingly scandalous performances. Alexander hosted banquets that would have made Emperor Caligula blush, where cardinals in their red robes mingled with courtesans in various states of undress. Wine flowed like communion wine should have, and the entertainment grew more debauched with each passing month. Lucrezia presided over these gatherings with the serene smile of a Madonna, as if blessing the debauchery with her presence. But even more shocking than the parties were the private moments. Servants whispered of finding the Pope and his daughter alone together in his chambers at dawn, both in states of undress that no amount of innocent explanation could justify. They spoke of Lucrezia emerging from her father's bedroom, with her hair disheveled and her lips swollen, as if from passionate kisses. The whispers spread through Rome like plague, carried on the lips of scandalized witnesses who dared not speak too loudly but could not remain entirely silent. Rome had seen corrupt popes before, but never one who so flagrantly violated the most fundamental taboos of civilization. The chair of St. Peter, from which Christ's representative was supposed to shepherd the faithful, had become the throne of a man who might well be committing the ultimate sin, the corruption of his own flesh and blood. The relationship between Pope Alexander VI and his daughter Lucrezia defied every convention of paternal love and papal propriety. What began as favoritism soon curdled into something far more sinister, a dynamic that made even hardened Roman courtiers cross themselves and mutter prayers for their souls simply for witnessing it. Lucrezia's first marriage was arranged when she was barely 13, to a Spanish noble who would cement Borgia power in Aragon. But the marriage was annulled before it could be consummated, dissolved by papal decree when a better political alliance presented itself. The second engagement, to a member of the powerful Sforza family, proceeded to its conclusion, but even the wedding ceremony carried undertones that disturbed those present. During the marriage feast, Pope Alexander insisted on sitting between his daughter and her new husband, feeding Lucrezia choice morsels with his own hands, while her bewildered groom watched. When the time came for the traditional bedding ceremony, the Pope delayed it for hours, keeping Lucrezia by his side until well past midnight. Guests later reported that when she finally retired to the bridal chamber, she wept inconsolably, not from maidenly nerves, but from what appeared to be genuine anguish at being separated from her father. The marriage to Giovanni Sforza proved to be a disaster. The young lord, initially dazzled by his papal connection, soon found himself relegated to the role of spectator in his own marriage. Lucrezia continued to spend her evenings with her father, often returning to their shared apartments long after her husband had retired alone. When Sforza attempted to assert his conjugal rights, he was met with tears, excuses, and increasingly frequent illnesses that kept his wife from his bed. The Borgia family dynamics grew even more disturbing with the presence of Cesare, Lucrezia's brother, and the Pope's eldest son. Cardinal Cesare Borgia was everything his father was, and more brilliant, ruthless, and utterly without moral restraint. He possessed the kind of magnetic cruelty that drew people to him, even as it terrified them. His relationship with his sister was as intense as it was inappropriate, marked by a possessiveness that went far beyond fraternal protection. Servants reported seeing Cesare and Lucrezia in embraces that lasted far too long, their bodies pressed together with an intimacy that no brother and sister should share. At family dinners, Cesare would seat himself next to his sister, his hand resting on her thigh beneath the table, while they shared whispered conversations that excluded everyone else, including the Pope. When Lucrezia laughed at something, her entire face would transform with a joy that her husband never inspired. The triangle of Pope, daughter, and son created an atmosphere of barely contained tension that permeated the Vatican. Servants learned to avert their eyes when entering rooms unexpectedly, having witnessed too many scenes that no Christian soul should ever see. The papal apartments reeked not just of incense and perfume, but of secrets too dark to speak aloud. You try not to look too closely at the family that rules your world. You learn to walk with your eyes downcast, to speak only when spoken to pretend that the sounds from the papal chambers are merely the wind rattling ancient stones. But late at night, when you lie in your narrow servant's bed, you cannot escape the knowledge of what you have seen. The Pope's hand lingering on his daughter's throat, like a lover's caress. Cesare's lips brushed against Lucrezia's neck in what he claimed was a brotherly kiss. The way they moved together like dancers, following steps no one else knew. You tell yourself that you misunderstood, that your eyes deceived you, that surely the Vicar of Christ could not be capable of such abominations. But deep in your heart, in the place where truth lives, regardless of how desperately you try to bury it, you know what you witnessed. The House of Borgia has turned the Vatican into their private stage for sins that have no names, and you are trapped as an unwilling witness to the corruption of everything holy. If Pope Alexander VI was the head of the Borgia serpent, then Cesare was its fangs sharp, venomous, and utterly without mercy. Made a cardinal at 18 by his doting father, Cesare possessed neither the patience nor the temperament for a life of prayer and contemplation. His calling was written in blood across the Italian peninsula, and his name would echo through history as the inspiration for Machiavelli's Prince, a handbook for rulers who understood that fear was more reliable than love. Cesare's decision to renounce his cardinal's hat in 1498 sent shockwaves through Christendom. Never before had a cardinal voluntarily abandoned his red robes for secular power. But Cesare was not a man bound by precedent. He had grown tired of the constraints of ecclesiastical office, weary of pretending piety while his true nature yearned for conquest. With his father's blessing and the Vatican treasury at his disposal, he set out to carve an empire from the fractured city-states of Italy. The transformation from cardinal to warlord was as swift as it was terrifying. Cesare discarded his religious vestments for armor that gleamed like black mirrors, and traded his breviary for a sword that soon became legendary for the speed with which it dispatched his enemies. He recruited an army of mercenaries, cutthroats, and ambitious nobles who shared his contempt for conventional morality. Together, they swept across the Romagna like a plague, leaving behind a trail of conquered cities and broken enemies. But Cesare's campaigns were notable not just for their success, but for their extraordinary cruelty. He perfected the art of psychological warfare, understanding that a reputation for ruthlessness could open more gates than any siege engine. In Sinigaglia, he invited his own allies to a peace banquet, then had them strangled during the feast. Their bodies were displayed in the town square as a warning to any who might consider betrayal. In Faenza, he ordered the young lord of the city to be murdered in his sleep, then took the man's sister as his mistress while her brother's blood still stained the castle walls. The relationship between Cesare and his sister Lucrezia deepened as his power grew, taking on dimensions that horrified even their jaded contemporaries. When Lucrezia's second marriage to Giovanni Sforza finally crumbled under the weight of neglect and scandal, it was Cesare who orchestrated the annulment. He personally delivered the papal decree that declared the marriage null and void, claiming with breathtaking audacity that it had never been consummated. Sforza, fleeing Rome in fear for his life, later wrote bitter letters claiming that the annulment was necessary because both father and son had designs on his wife. The truth of those accusations seemed to manifest in the increasingly open affection between the Borgia siblings. At state dinners, Cesare would sit beside Lucrezia with his hand resting possessively on her shoulder, his fingers playing with the golden strands of her hair while ambassadors watched in stunned silence. When she laughed at his jokes, he would lean close enough to whisper in her ear, his lips brushing her skin in a manner that no brother should ever touch his sister. Their intimacy reached its most scandalous peak during what history remembers as the Banquet of Chestnuts, held in the papal apartments in October 1501. 50 courtesans were invited to dine naked with the Pope, his children, and selected cardinals. After the meal, chestnuts were scattered across the floor, and the prostitutes crawled on hands and knees to collect them, while the assembled dignitaries watched and wagered on the performance. But what truly shocked witnesses was not the presence of naked women. Such entertainment was common enough in corrupt Rome, but the active participation of the Pope's own children, Lucrezia and Cesare, did not merely observe the debauchery. They orchestrated it, moving among the courtesans with the casual ease of connoisseurs. Witnesses reported seeing Cesare select two of the most beautiful women and lead them to a private chamber, only to return an hour later with Lucrezia beside him, both in states of undress that suggested they had shared more than conversation. When the Pope awarded prizes to the men who could couple with the most prostitutes, both his son and daughter served as judges, their hands intertwined as they announced the winners. The Vatican had become a brothel, and the papal family were its most enthusiastic patrons. But even worse than their public debauchery was the private corruption that festered behind closed doors. Servants spoke in whispers of finding Cesare and Lucrezia together in her chambers at dawn, their bodies entwined in sleep like lovers rather than siblings. They told of hearing sounds through the walls that no brother and sister should ever make together, of discovering bloodstains on sheets that suggested either violence or passion too intense for civilized understanding. You serve wine at these gatherings, your hands trembling as you pour vintage that costs more than your family earns in a year. You try to keep your eyes down, to think of prayers or psalms or anything that might cleanse the images burning into your memory. But you cannot escape what you see. The Pope's son and daughter moving together like two parts of the same corrupted soul, their love twisted into something that makes demons weep with envy. When you finally retreat to your quarters, you kneel before your crucifix and beg forgiveness, not for your own sins, but for being witness to theirs. Because in the depths of your terrified heart, you know that what you have seen will damn not just the house of Borgia, but everyone who enabled their corruption through silence. Lucrezia's third marriage was meant to restore some measure of respectability to the Borgia name. But like everything the family touched, it curdled into tragedy and blood. Alfonso of Aragon was young, handsome, and possessed of an innocence that made him fatally unsuited for life in the Borgia orbit. At 17, he arrived in Rome, believing he was gaining a beautiful wife and powerful papal connections. He could not have known he was walking into a spider's web where even the silken threads were poisoned. The wedding ceremony in 1498 was a magnificent affair that disguised its underlying rottenness with cloth of gold and clouds of frankincense. Lucrezia, barely 18 herself, glided down the aisle in a gown that had cost the equivalent of a small city's annual taxes, her golden hair crowned with a diadem of pearls that had once belonged to a Byzantine empress. She looked every inch the papal princess, radiant and pure as fresh snow. But those who knew the family's secrets saw something else in her eyes, a sadness so deep it seemed to reach into her very soul. Pope Alexander performed the marriage ceremony himself, his hands trembling slightly as he blessed the union. Whether from age, wine, or some deeper emotion was impossible to say. Cesare stood as his sister's witness, resplendent in black velvet that made his dark eyes appear even more dangerous. Throughout the ceremony, his gaze never left Lucrezia's face, and those close enough to observe noticed that his jaw clenched every time she repeated her vows to Alfonso. The wedding feast that followed was a masterpiece of papal excess. The Great Hall of the Vatican was transformed into a wonderland of silk pavilions and golden fountains that flowed with wine instead of water. Tables groaned under the weight of peacocks stuffed with smaller birds, sugar sculptures that depicted scenes from classical mythology, and delicacies imported from the furthest corners of the known world. But beneath the celebration lay an undercurrent of tension that even the most expensive entertainment could not dispel. Alfonso, young and overwhelmed by the magnificence surrounding him, tried his best to play the part of the happy bridegroom. He toasted his bride with increasingly desperate enthusiasm, attempting to match the Borgias' sophisticated banter while growing more bewildered by the hour. The papal family's dynamics were unlike anything in his previous experience. The Pope treated Lucrezia with an intimacy that seemed to exclude everyone else at the table, feeding her choice morsels and whispering private jokes that made her laugh with genuine delight. Cesare monopolized her other side, his conversation so engaging that she turned toward him rather than her new husband. As the evening wore on, Alfonso began to understand that he had not gained a wife so much as he had been permitted to share one. When the time came for the traditional bedding ceremony, both the Pope and Cesare insisted on escorting the couple to their chamber. They lingered in the bridal suite far longer than propriety demanded, with Cesare examining the bed linens and the Pope blessing the room with an intensity that bordered on the obsessive. When they finally left, Alfonso was alone with his bride for the first time since their betrothal. What transpired that night was never fully recorded, but servants reported hearing raised voices from the bridal chamber, followed by long periods of silence, then what sounded like weeping. When Lucrezia emerged the next morning, her face was pale and drawn, and she moved with the careful precision of someone trying to hide pain. Alfonso appeared later, his wedding finery replaced with traveling clothes, and he spoke to no one before departing for his estates outside Rome. The marriage that was supposed to last a lifetime barely survived its first month. Alfonso returned to Rome sporadically, always staying briefly and leaving without explanation. Rumors swirled about what had driven the young bridegroom away, with some suggesting that he had discovered his wife was not the virgin she was supposed to be, while others whispered darker possibilities. The truth, whatever it was, remained locked behind Lucrezia's increasingly distant smile and Alfonso's growing determination to avoid the papal court entirely. The final tragedy began to unfold in July 1500, when Alfonso was attacked by armed men on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica. Multiple wounds to his head and body left him near death, but somehow he survived long enough to be carried to his chambers in the papal palace. For weeks, Lucrezia nursed him with a devotion that surprised even her critics, never leaving his bedside and personally preparing his food to ensure it contained no poison, a precaution that spoke volumes about life in the Borgia household. But Alfonso's recovery was not welcomed by all members of the family. Cesare, who had been absent from Rome during the attack, returned to find his sister playing the devoted wife to a man he openly despised. The sight of Lucrezia caring for Alfonso with such tenderness ignited a jealousy that burned hotter than the Roman sun. Within days of his return, servants noticed that the guards around Alfonso's chambers had been quietly replaced with men loyal to Cesare. On a sweltering August night, as Alfonso lay recovering under his wife's watchful care, death came for him with silent footsteps. The official account claimed that he died from his injuries, but Lucrezia's screams echoing through the papal palace told a different story. When dawn broke over Rome, Alfonso of Aragon was dead, and his young widow was left to contemplate the terrible mathematics of loving a Borgia. Everyone who came too close to their inner circle eventually paid with their lives. You helped carry Alfonso's body from the death chamber, and the weight of him was nothing compared to the weight of what you witnessed. Lucrezia knelt beside the bed, her golden hair now streaked with gray that had not been there the night before, her hands clutching her dead husband's cold fingers while tears fell like rain on marble. But it was not grief alone that marked her face. It was the terrible knowledge that she had become complicit in her own husband's murder, trapped in a family where love and death were so intertwined that she could no longer tell the difference. Death came for Pope Alexander VI on a summer evening in 1503, arriving with the same sudden brutality that had characterized his reign. The official cause was fever, but in Rome, where poison flowed as freely as communion wine, few accepted such simple explanations. The Pope had dined earlier that day at the villa of Cardinal Adriano Castellesi, sharing wine and conversation with his host, while his son Cesare attended to other business. By nightfall, both father and son were violently ill, vomiting blood and convulsing with agony that no physician could relieve. The irony was exquisite and terrible. Rodrigo Borgia, who had eliminated so many enemies with carefully administered toxins, may have finally tasted his own medicine. Whether the poison was intended for him or whether he accidentally consumed wine meant for another victim became irrelevant as his life ebbed away in the same papal apartments where he had orchestrated so much death and debauchery. Cesare, younger and stronger, survived the poisoning but was left weakened at the precise moment when his father's protection vanished forever. As word of the Pope's death spread through Rome, the city transformed overnight from a playground for Borgia ambitions into their graveyard. The Spanish guards who had enforced papal authority melted away like morning mist, their loyalty purchased with gold that would no longer flow. Cardinals who had cowered before Alexander's wrath suddenly discovered reserves of moral outrage they had hidden for over a decade. The same courtiers who had applauded at the banquet of chestnuts now crossed themselves piously and spoke of the need for spiritual renewal. Lucrezia, now 23 and widowed for the second time, found herself alone in ways that went far beyond her father's death. The woman who had once commanded armies of admirers discovered that her beauty meant nothing without the Pope's power to protect it. Whispers that had been carefully muffled during Alexander's reign now echoed openly through the Vatican corridors, painting her as everything from an innocent victim to an active participant in her family's corruption. The speed of their fall was breathtaking. Properties that had been seized by papal decree were reclaimed by their original owners. Titles granted to Borgia allies were revoked with the same casual efficiency that had once characterized their distribution. The Borgia coat of arms, the red bull that had struck terror into the hearts of Italian nobles, was systematically chiseled away from buildings, torn from tapestries, and erased from official documents, as if the family had never existed. Cesare, despite his illness, fought desperately to maintain some fragment of his former power. But without the Vatican treasury to fund his mercenaries and the papal authority to legitimize his conquests, his empire crumbled like a sandcastle before an incoming tide. Cities that had submitted to his brutal rule declared their independence, often celebrating their freedom by executing any Borgia supporters they could find. The man who had inspired Machiavelli's treatise on political power became a living example of how quickly that power could evaporate. The new pope, Pius III, lasted only 26 days, long enough to begin the process of purging Borgia influence, but not long enough to complete it. His successor, Julius II, approached the task with the enthusiasm of a reformer and the thoroughness of an inquisitor. Every trace of the Borgia papacy was methodically eliminated. Frescoes were painted over, sculptures were destroyed, and documents were either burned or locked away in archives that would remain sealed for centuries. Lucrezia, stripped of her papal protection and her brother's military might, was forced to rely on the one asset that remained to her, her value as a bride. Her third marriage, to Alfonso d'Este, heir to the Duke of Ferrara, was arranged with the same cold calculation that had characterized all Borgia alliances. But this time she entered the negotiation from a position of weakness rather than strength. The d'Este family demanded enormous dowries and guarantees before accepting a bride whose reputation had become synonymous with scandal. As she prepared to leave Rome forever, traveling north to a new life in Ferrara, Lucrezia took one final look at the Vatican that had been both her palace and her prison. The papal apartments where she had dined with her father were being stripped of their furnishings. The halls where she had walked beside Cesare were echoing with the footsteps of new occupants who spoke of moral renewal and spiritual reform. The chambers where she may have committed sins that had no names were being blessed and purified by priests who whispered prayers for the cleansing of corruption. The Borgia era was ending not with the dramatic confrontation of a tragedy, but with the quiet efficiency of institutional housekeeping. History was being rewritten in real time, edited by papal scribes who understood that some stories were too dangerous to preserve intact. Official records began describing Alexander VI as a reforming pope whose legacy had been unfairly maligned by his enemies. Lucrezia became a devoted daughter who had been slandered by jealous rivals. Cesare transformed from a ruthless warlord into a defender of papal territories against foreign invasion. But the servants remembered. Courtesans whispered to their clients. The ambassadors wrote coded letters to their masters. The truth survived in fragments, scattered across Europe, like seeds that would eventually grow into the legends that refused to die. Because no amount of official revision could erase the memory of what Rome had witnessed during those 11 years when the Borgias ruled from the throne of St. Peter. You watched the great cleansing from the shadows, your servants' invisibility protecting you from the purges that eliminated more visible witnesses. You saw the furnishings burned, the portraits slashed, the very stones scrubbed as if holy water could wash away the memory of what had transpired upon them. But late at night, when the Vatican lay quiet under its blanket of official forgetfulness, you still heard echoes of laughter from the papal apartments, still caught the ghost of perfume in corridors that now reeked only of piety and disinfectant. The house of Borgia was falling, but its shadow would stretch across centuries, darkening the reputation of the papacy long after the last of their bloodline had crumbled into dust. The question that has haunted historians for 5 centuries refuses to rest quietly in the archives of the Vatican's secret library. Did Pope Alexander VI commit incest with his own daughter? The accusation is so monstrous, so fundamentally destructive to both papal authority and human decency, that it demands the highest standard of proof. Yet the evidence, while circumstantial, forms a pattern too consistent to dismiss as mere political slander. The most damning testimonies come from contemporary witnesses whose credibility cannot be easily challenged. Johannes Burchard, the papal master of ceremonies, and a man whose position required him to document everything that occurred in the Vatican, recorded disturbing observations in his secret diary. He described finding Pope Alexander and Lucrezia alone together in circumstances that violated every protocol of papal propriety. On multiple occasions, Burchard wrote, he discovered them in the Pope's private chambers, with Lucrezia seated on her father's lap, both partially clothed, engaged in intimate conversation that ceased abruptly when he entered. The Venetian ambassador, Antonio Giustiniani, wrote dispatches to the Doge that painted an even darker picture. He described state dinners where the Pope fed Lucrezia from his own plate, their fingers intertwining over shared goblets of wine in gestures that belonged in a bedchamber rather than a formal audience. More shocking still, Giustiniani reported witnessing Alexander caress his daughter's throat and shoulders with a tenderness that made the seasoned diplomat physically ill. These were not the casual touches of a father, but the lingering caresses of a lover. The French envoy, Philippe de Comines, provided perhaps the most explicit testimony. In coded letters to King Louis XII, he described a private audience where he inadvertently witnessed Pope Alexander and Lucrezia in an embrace that he characterized as more fitting for Sodom than for the seat of St. Peter. The ambassador reported that both father and daughter were in states of undress, and that their separation upon his entrance was accompanied by such confusion and shame as would mark discovered adulterers. But it was the birth of Lucrezia's mysterious child in 1498 that provided the most concrete evidence for the incest allegations. The infant, whom history knows only as the Roman Infante, arrived under circumstances that defied every conventional explanation. Lucrezia had been living in the papal apartments, rarely venturing outside and maintaining no contact with any man except her father and brother. Yet she gave birth to a son whose parentage was never officially acknowledged. 2 papal bulls were issued regarding the child, an unprecedented action that suggested the Pope's direct involvement in resolving questions of legitimacy. The first bull declared the infant to be Cesare's bastard by an unnamed Roman woman. The second, issued secretly the same day, named Pope Alexander himself as the father. The existence of contradictory documents suggested a cover-up so frantic that it defeated its own purpose, creating more suspicions than it resolved. The physical evidence was equally troubling. Witnesses described the infant as bearing an unmistakable resemblance to the Pope, the same distinctive Borgia features that marked all of Alexander's acknowledged children, but combined with Lucrezia's golden coloring in a way that suggested her direct involvement in his conception. More damning still, the child was raised in the papal apartments, with a level of attention and resources that far exceeded what any bastard grandchild might expect. The infamous banquet of chestnuts provided additional fuel for the incest allegations. Multiple witnesses, including Cardinal Francesco Soderini and the Ferrara ambassador, described seeing Pope Alexander, Cesare, and Lucrezia participating together in sexual activities with the assembled prostitutes. But more shocking than their individual debauchery was their collective behavior. The papal family moved among the courtesans as a unit, sharing partners and engaging in acts that witnesses described as beyond the capacity of Christian language to describe. One particularly disturbing account came from a Florentine merchant who had attended the banquet as a guest of Cardinal Riario. He described seeing Lucrezia and her father withdraw to a private chamber accompanied by 2 of the most beautiful courtesans, only to emerge an hour later with the women dismissed and the papal family members in various states of undress. The merchant, writing years later from the safety of exile, claimed that both Pope and daughter displayed the satisfaction of lovers rather than the casual demeanor of those who had merely observed others' pleasure. The psychological evidence was perhaps most compelling of all. Lucrezia's behavior throughout her adult life bore the hallmarks of a woman trapped in an abusive relationship with her own father. Her marriages consistently failed not from incompatibility or political maneuvering, but from her apparent inability to form genuine intimate bonds with men outside her family circle. Each of her husbands reported the same disturbing pattern: a wife who seemed more comfortable with her father and brother than with her own spouse, who spoke of them with a devotion that bordered on worship, and who became physically ill when separated from them for extended periods. The testimony of Giovanni Sforza, Lucrezia's second husband, provided the most explicit accusations. After fleeing Rome in fear for his life, Sforza publicly declared that his marriage had been annulled because His Holiness wishes to use his daughter for his own purposes. Sforza stated bluntly that the Pope was intimate with his own daughter and that this relationship had made a normal marriage impossible. These were not the desperate lies of a discarded political ally, but the anguished accusations of a man who had witnessed something that shattered his understanding of human decency. Perhaps most telling of all was Lucrezia's own behavior in her final years. After leaving Rome and the protection of her family, she transformed from a vibrant, politically engaged woman into a reclusive figure who spoke obsessively of sin and redemption. She spent her last decades engaged in increasingly extreme religious practices, founding convents and endowing masses for the souls of the damned, with a fervor that suggested personal guilt rather than general piety. Her letters from this period, preserved in the Ferrara archives, return again and again to themes of divine judgment and the possibility of forgiveness for sins too terrible to name. The truth, buried beneath centuries of papal censorship and historical revisionism, emerges in these fragments like bones washing up on a distant shore. Each piece of evidence, taken alone, might admit innocent explanation, but together they form a pattern of corruption so comprehensive that it transforms the Vatican of Alexander VI from a place of spiritual authority into a theater of the damned. You cannot know with absolute certainty what transpired behind the golden doors of the papal apartments. History preserves accusations, not confessions. But in the sleepless nights that follow your service in the Borgia household, when conscience wars with discretion and memory refuses to be silenced, you understand that some truths are too monstrous for official acknowledgement. The Pope who claimed to speak for God on earth may well have committed the ultimate blasphemy, the corruption of his own flesh and blood, in the very shadow of St. Peter's throne. The Borgia name survived their fall from papal grace, but it carried with it a stain that no amount of time or penance could fully cleanse. Lucrezia lived for another 30 years after leaving Rome, becoming Duchess of Ferrara and mother to children who would never know the full truth of their ancestry. She threw herself into patronage of the arts and works of charity with the desperate intensity of a woman seeking to balance cosmic scales. Poets praised her wisdom and generosity, but those who looked closely into her winter-blue eyes saw shadows that no earthly accomplishment could banish. Cesare met a more fitting end, dying in 1507 at the siege of Vienna, his body pierced by 23 wounds in a battle that had nothing to do with his grand ambitions and everything to do with simple military necessity. The man who had inspired Machiavelli's Prince became a cautionary tale about the transience of power built on fear alone. His death was mourned by no one except the prostitutes who had entertained him and the soldiers who had shared his plunder. But the true legacy of the House of Borgia lay not in their individual fates, but in the permanent damage they inflicted upon the papacy itself. The corruption of Alexander VI's reign provided Martin Luther and the Protestant reformers with ammunition that would echo for centuries. When Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, he was responding not just to contemporary abuses, but to the lingering memory of a pope who had turned the Vatican into a brothel and possibly committed incest with his own daughter. The Catholic Church's response was swift and comprehensive. The Borgia era was systematically erased from official histories, their records sealed or destroyed, their very existence minimized in papal chronicles. But the damage was already done. The questions raised by Alexander VI's pontificate about papal infallibility, about the nature of divine authority, about whether earthly corruption could coexist with heavenly mandate, would haunt Catholic theology for generations. In the centuries that followed, the Borgias became legend rather than history. Their story filtered through novels, operas, and eventually television dramas that transformed their crimes into entertainment. But beneath the romanticization lay the terrible truth that for 11 years, the man who claimed to be Christ's representative on earth had presided over a court that would have made pagan emperors blush with shame. The Vatican today houses one of the world's greatest art collections, its museums filled with masterpieces that inspire millions of visitors annually. Tourists walk through halls where Renaissance popes once held court, admiring frescoes and sculptures that represent humanity's highest artistic achievements. Few realize that they are retracing the steps of Alexander VI and his children, walking through chambers where the most fundamental taboos of civilization may have been violated in the name of papal authority. Modern historians approach the Borgia era with academic caution, noting the political motivations behind many accusations and the impossibility of proving the most serious charges. But the pattern of corruption was so comprehensive, the contemporary testimony so consistent, that even the most charitable interpretations cannot fully exonerate Pope Alexander VI and his family. They remain figures suspended between history and legend, their crimes too terrible to ignore but too distant to prosecute. The incense still burns in St. Peter's Basilica, and pilgrims still kneel before the altar where Rodrigo Borgia once celebrated Mass. The chair of St. Peter continues to command the loyalty of over 1 billion Catholics worldwide, its authority undiminished by the sins of individual occupants. But in the deepest vaults of the Vatican's secret archives, Sealed documents rest in acid-free containers, waiting for the day when historians will finally be permitted to read the full truth about the Pope who may have fathered children with his own daughter. Until then, the House of Borgia remains what it always was, a reminder that earthly power, no matter how divinely sanctioned it claims to be, cannot escape the gravitational pull of human corruption. Their story echoes across the centuries, not as entertainment, but as warning that when we invest mortals with the authority of gods, we should not be surprised when they reveal themselves to be something far less than human. You have followed this story to its end, walking through corridors where angels fear to tread, witnessing corruption so comprehensive that it transforms sacred spaces into crime scenes. The Vatican of Alexander VI was not merely a place where bad things happened, it was a laboratory for testing the limits of human depravity, an experiment in discovering how far divine authority could bend before it finally broke. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Borgia legacy is not what they did, but how easily it was forgotten. Within a generation of Alexander VI's death, the official histories had been sanitized, the documents sealed, the witnesses silenced or discredited. The Church's capacity for institutional memory proved to be matched only by its talent for institutional amnesia. The Borgias became a cautionary tale precisely because they were treated as an aberration rather than a revelation. The truth is that Pope Alexander VI and his family were not unique in their corruption. They were simply more flagrant in their display of it. The Renaissance papacy was built on the foundation of simony, nepotism, and the casual blending of spiritual authority with temporal power. What made the Borgias exceptional was not their crimes, but their refusal to hide them behind the traditional veils of hypocrisy and discretion. In this, they performed an inadvertent service to history. They showed the world what absolute power looks like when stripped of all pretense to moral authority. They demonstrated that divine appointment means nothing when divorced from divine behavior, that papal infallibility is a doctrine that extends to matters of faith and morals but stops well short of personal conduct. The questions raised by their pontificate remain relevant today, not just for Catholics but for anyone who lives under systems of authority that claim moral legitimacy. How do we balance respect for institutions with acknowledgement of their human failures? How do we separate the message from the messenger when the messenger proves to be fatally flawed? How do we maintain faith in systems of belief when their earthly representatives reveal themselves to be capable of the most fundamental betrayals? The Borgias offer no easy answers to these questions, but they provide a harsh education in the necessity of asking them. Their story reminds us that power without accountability inevitably becomes tyranny, that authority without transparency inevitably enables abuse, and that the higher the pedestal we place our leaders upon, the further they have to fall when gravity finally claims them. When you kneel in churches today, when you see religious leaders speaking with the authority of divine appointment, remember the lesson of the House of Borgia, that the robes make the man only if the man proves worthy of the robes. The incense may burn sweet, the gold may gleam bright, and the authority may seem absolute, but beneath the pageantry and ceremony, we are all merely human, capable of both transcendent goodness and appalling evil. The Pope, who may have slept with his daughter, teaches us that there are no automatic saints, no positions so holy that they cannot be corrupted, no institutions so sacred that they cannot be perverted by the humans who lead them. It is a hard lesson, bought with the blood of innocence, and paid for with the credibility of one of history's most powerful institutions. But it is a lesson we forget at our peril, because the capacity for corruption that destroyed the moral authority of Alexander VI did not die with him in 1503. It lives on in every heart that beats with ambition, in every mind that confuses power with righteousness, in every soul that believes its own elevation places it beyond the reach of moral law. The House of Borgia fell, but the forces that created it remain eternal, which is why their story must be remembered, told, and retold until the last human heart beats its final corrupted rhythm. They are the reminder we need when the incense burns too sweet, the gold gleams too bright, and the voices of authority speak too confidently of their divine mandate. In the end, the greatest sin of Pope Alexander VI may not have been sleeping with his daughter, it may have been forgetting that he was human.